I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is episode 29 of my series on the JFK assassination, and the final episode of this series on the assassination. I hope you all have found it valuable. I want to thank you for your interest and your attention watching the series. Thank you for your great comments. And what we're going to do in this final segment is put everything into context, sort of a recap, a summary, putting all the pieces together. And to do that, we're going to start with what happened when the Constitution was enacted. The Constitution brought into existence what is called a limited government republic. That's a type of government whose powers are extremely weak, extremely limited. They didn't have to do that. They could have called into existence a government with omnipotent powers, general powers, where the president and the Congress and the Supreme Court just had the power to do whatever they believed was necessary in the interests of the people, society, the world, etc. Our American ancestors didn't want that type of government. They wanted a government whose powers are very weak and very limited, and that's because they didn't trust the government. They considered the government the biggest threat to their freedom, not some foreign nation, not some foreign group. Their own government, the federal government, they considered the biggest potential threat to their freedom and their well-being. And that's why they wanted to limit its powers. And to make even more certain that federal officials got the point, the American people, our ancestors, demanded the enactment of the Bill of Rights, which really should have been called a Bill of Prohibitions, because it restricts the power of the federal government even more, including killing people. That's what the Fifth Amendment was about. It says you can't go out and start killing people arbitrarily. If you're going to kill somebody, you've got to go through due process of law, which is a term stretching all the way back to Magna Carta in 1215. It guarantees formal notice of the charges against a person before you can kill him, in a hearing where he has an opportunity to be heard and defend himself. They guarantee trial by jury for this purpose. So this was the kind of government that was brought into existence. Very small military force, because our American ancestors just didn't trust large military establishments. Why? Because they knew that historically large military establishments were grave threats to the freedom and democratic processes of a society. Now, that was our heritage, a limited government republic for some 150 years or so. Then, post-World War II, right after World War II, everything changes. This was one of the revolutionary transformations in the U.S. government. Americans, I don't think, realized it at the time, but it is actually even much bigger than the welfare state revolution, where America's economic system got converted from a free market private property order to what is called a welfare state system in the 1930s, where the government takes money from one group of people and gives it to another group of people. Well, the transformation that took place in 1945 and onward was the conversion of the federal government from a limited government republic to a national security state. Now, a national security state is a totalitarian type of government, a governmental structure. It entails the government having not limited powers, but omnipotent powers, including the power to assassinate people, kill people without due process of law. So this was a way that they circumvented the Fifth Amendment by simply declaring and reforming the government into a national security state. A national security state, as I said, is a totalitarian type of governmental system. The Soviet Union, which was run by a communist regime, and which was the excuse for the conversion of the federal government to a national security state, was itself a national security state. The argument was that we're facing this implacable foe, the Soviet Union, which had a worldwide communist conspiracy to take over the world based in Moscow, and that if we didn't convert our federal government to a national security state, they would ultimately win. They would conquer the United States. They'd take over the federal government. They'd be running the IRS. They'd be running the public schools and teaching communism to all the children of America. And the idea was that the communists were coming to get us. I mean, there was absolutely no doubt among U.S. officials. So they said, in order to stop this threat, we need to temporarily convert America into the same type of totalitarian system. And that's how we get the giant military establishment. Prior to that, there was this small military force, a small army throughout the 1800s, because Americans didn't trust large military establishments. But then all of a sudden, you get this gigantic, sprawling military establishment, bases all over the United States, bases around the world. Then you get the CIA, which has the power to assassinate people. It has the power to effect regime change operations, bribe foreign congressmen, and spy on people, and so forth. And then you get the NSA, which has the power to conduct secret surveillance on people around the world, including the United States. So these are all totalitarian-like powers, but the idea was that if we don't do this, we the American people don't do this, we're going to fall to communism. And President Truman, who was bringing this thing into existence, was even told, like, if we're going to pull this off, you got to scare the hell out of the American people. And that scare came through with respect to this anti-Russia, anti-Soviet Union mindset. I mean, to get a sense of what the mindset was, take the anti-Russia mindset today. You know how strong that is among the mainstream press, the mainstream parties, and multiply that by about 1,000. And then you get a sense of what life was like during the Cold War. And ironically, during the war, the Soviet Union was America's partner and ally, and Hitler's enemy. And then as soon as the war is over, the U.S. officials say, well, now we need to make Hitler's enemy our enemy. And so that's Hitler's enemy, and our partner and ally become the new official enemy, who was even more dangerous, they said, than Hitler himself. And so everything now had to change. And so throughout the Cold War, there were all these measures, and everything revolved around security. Security. You can go Google security posters, NSA, and you can see the kind of posters that people were seeing, you know, in public places. Security, security. And you know how they tell you right now, if you see anything suspicious at a train station or a bus station or anywhere, contact, you know, the authorities. Well, it was like 1,000 times like that during the whole Cold War. And this was where they went after communists. They went after the Communist Party. Even though in a genuinely free society, people have a right to promote whatever they want to promote. I mean, that's sort of like what the First Amendment was designed to protect. But remember, everything changes now with the national security state, because the national security state trumps the Bill of Rights. It trumps the Constitution. National security in a national security state is everything. And of course, needless to say, the Supreme Court rolled over and deferred to the new national security state on whatever they wanted. And the national security state during this period of time gets stronger and stronger. And then there's this obsession with going after communists. And they go after Dalton Trumbo, the Hollywood Aid, all the Hollywood writers, the Hollywood blacklist, where they're throwing people out of work because they supposedly had communist affiliations. You recall the McCarthy hearings, where they were summoning people and saying, you know, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And if you said yes, I mean, you were done. I mean, your employer would fire you. You couldn't get a job. If you took the Fifth Amendment, so you wouldn't incriminate yourself, that would be just as bad. That was akin to a confession of guilt. And then they were looking for communists in the army. So the worst thing in the world ever that you could be was a communist. And they were infiltrating groups like the Communist Party, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. They were infiltrating people into other communist organizations. There was even a movie called I Led Three Lives, a television series, where you can still see segments on YouTube, and I recommend them. It's very fascinating. That it was a story of an FBI agent who secretly posed as a communist, and he would ferret out communist cells and then report them back to the FBI. Well, but with one exception, and as we discussed, that one exception was Lee Harvey Oswald. I mean, this is the most incredible Cold War miracle that you could ever find. Because while they're going after people who maybe a lot of just had low profiles, but they had communism in their background, here's a guy that's waving his arms It's like a red cape in front of a bull saying, I'm a communist. I'm a communist. I mean, he goes to he's, okay, ex-Marine. Uh, Now, the allegation, of course, on Oswald was that he was studying communism before he joined the Marines when he was high school. Well, interestingly enough, his favorite television program was I Led Three Lives, the program I just mentioned, about a secret agent posing as a communist. So this guy joins the Marines. Now, how many communists have you ever seen join the Marines? I mean, the Marines had just killed millions of people in North Korea. We're talking about the 1950s. This was a part of the Cold War, a hot war like Korea and later Vietnam, to keep the communists from coming over here. If we don't stop them over there, they'll come over here. And so, what are the chances that a communist is going to join the Marines, especially since the Korean War is just suspended? There was never a peace treaty, so the Marines could be called upon on a moment's notice to go kill more communists. So here the supposed communist is joining the Marines where he could go kill more communists. It just has never made any sense. And then they let him out early. He goes to the Soviet Union. He goes to the American embassy and he makes this big hullabaloo. I'm defecting. I'm defecting. Here's my passport. I'm going to give up secrets. And the secrets he was going to give up was where he was stationed at Atsugi Air Force Base when he was in the Marines. And then all this despite the fact that he was openly in the Marines studying Marxism and studying Russian. He became fluent in Russian. I mean, I think anybody who's studied a foreign language knows that that's impossible without a tutor or a mentor, especially in a language as difficult as Russian. And of course, the military has language schools for that. They have tutors, they have mentors, and so forth. So Oswald's even his own fellow military guy, personnel there, his friends would call him Osvaldovich. So here you got this Cold War going on. They're going after Trumbo and all these. Oswald isn't touched, and he's in the military. They were even trying to ferret out, communists in the military stuff, but not Oswald. And then he goes over there and he's going to tell all his secrets, which presumably would include secrets relating to the CIA's top secret spy plane, the U-2, which was stationed at Atsugi Air Force Base in Japan, where he was stationed. So he comes back home and he's practically given a red carpet treatment. There's a group called Traveler's Aid that helps him come back with a wife that has communist connections, or uncle or something was part of the Soviet intelligence force. But hey, that doesn't stop them from coming on back to the United States, moving to Dallas, getting a job with a top secret photography firm that does top secret photography for the U.S. government. And he's mentored by a guy named de Mohrenschildt, who's a conservative and has U.S. intelligence written all over him. The picture becomes increasingly clear that this guy is an intelligence agent who was posing as a communist. And they had those kind of people because, remember, they're infiltrating communist organizations, both the CIA and the FBI. And of course, to infiltrate, you got to present yourself as a communist. You got to convince people that you're a communist. If they get suspicious that you're not a real communist, you're out. And so here's a guy that's being infiltrated into the Soviet Union. And then he goes to New Orleans and he's again waving the red cape. I'm a communist. I'm a communist. But he's seen in the offices of Guy Bannister, an FBI agent, retired FBI agent, right in the middle of the intelligence community. He gets a job with a coffee company whose owner is a right-wing, anti-communist, fierce anti-communist, anti-Castro type. What are the chances of that he's gonna get a former supposed defector to the Soviet Union to come and work for him? It defies credulity. And then he's passing out pamphlets where he inadvertently stamps Bannister's address, the side street address to his office. And then he's down in Mexico City, again waving the cape. Oh, I'm a communist, I'm a communist. And then they don't do anything to this guy. I mean, they don't give him the Edward Snowden treatment. They don't give him the Julian Assange treatment. They don't give him the John Walker Lynn treatment. They don't give him any of this. Like I say, it's a Cold War miracle story. Unless you conclude that he was a U.S. intelligence agent posing as a communist. That was his cover. And of course, that was the rumor that the Warren Commission heard right at the very beginning. They had received information. And Warren calls that top secret meeting where he says, don't ever reveal the existence of this meeting. He tells the court reporter, destroy your transcript of this. Everybody was sworn to secrecy. And the only reason we learned about it is the court reporter forgot to destroy her tape recording of it. And so the way they resolve it is they ask the head of the FBI and the CIA to just deny that that Oswald was working for them, and they denied it, and that was the end of it. No real investigation into the truthfulness of this allegation. Obviously, it was very uncomfortable for the Warren Commission. I mean, even if they bought into this notion that he was a lone nut, if he was an intelligence agent, they got to do a lot of investigating as to why a U.S. intelligence agent would kill the president. So you've got this strange, surreal situation with Oswald. Now, if we move to 1961, General Eisenhower, who was now President Eisenhower, is giving his farewell address. And he talks about this deep state. He didn't call it that. He called it a military-industrial complex instead of a national security state or a deep state. But he pointed out to the American people that this thing is very, very dangerous. This apparatus, it's a very potential threat to the freedom and well-being of the American people and to our democratic processes, which was precisely why the framers, our founding fathers, our American ancestors didn't want this type of government. If you had told them that the Constitution was bringing into existence a national security state, they would have never approved the deal. But they would have continued operating under the Articles of Confederation. And Eisenhower is saying this structure, this totalitarian-like structure, is a grave threat to our democratic processes and to our freedom. Well, he had seen what it had been doing. In 1953, the CIA initiates a coup against a democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, because they perceived he was a threat to U.S. national security, because he was leaning communist. He was nationalizing British oil interests. And then 1 year later, they do a regime change operation against a democratically elected president, and that is Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. And here's where they had an assassination list. Now, we don't know who was on the list. They still won't let us know. They won't let us see the list because national security, they said. But clearly Arbenz was at the top of the list. He's the president they were trying to oust. So they have no reluctance about assassinating a foreign president. And then there's the assassination manual that came into existence at that time that we didn't learn about till the 1990s, where they're studying the art of assassination. And equally important, they're studying the art of covering up their role in the assassination. So this is what they're specializing in. How do we keep people from discovering that we're the ones behind this assassination? And you can imagine there had to have been study sessions, classes. I mean, these are very brilliant people in the CIA, Ivy League types that are trying to figure out, how can we accomplish this? Assassinating people and then covering up our role. And then so Kennedy's coming into office, but before he comes into office, there's two plans that are in effect. One is to assassinate, the CIA's plan to assassinate the leader of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba, who they perceived as a communist because he was friendly to the Soviet Union. And remember, this is the Cold War. Their mindset in the Pentagon, the CIA was, and the NSA was that if you're not with us, you're on the other side. This is a war to the finish. That there can be never any peaceful coexistence, never negotiated peace, nothing. This was going to be a war to the finish. The communists versus the so-called capitalists. And so this is why they went after Mossadegh. This is why they went after Arbenz. This is why they conspired to assassinate Lumumba. And they made sure Lumumba was assassinated before Kennedy came into office because they knew that Kennedy would disapprove it. So they rushed it, and they accomplished it. And like I indicated before, when Kennedy learned about Lumumba's assassination, there's a famous picture that you can see online. And just Google Kennedy Lumumba, and you can find it under images. And he's got this anguished look on his face. Because while Kennedy had come into office as a standard Cold Warrior, pretty much so, he was very reticent about concluding that third world independence movements were communist. Now, according to the CIA, and the Pentagon, there was no doubt that they were communist movements, that any movement that would try to throw off the shackles of the British Empire or the Belgian Empire, the French Empire, was clearly communistic in their view. Kennedy said no. He says these are nationalist movements. They're just tired of imperialism. They're tired of the colonialists running their lands and their nations. So Kennedy comes in with that little variation, which makes him suspect automatically in the eyes of the national security establishment, which has had pretty much free reign to run the show. But Kennedy comes in and things start to change because he's exercising more control. And the problem starts out with the Bay of Pigs, where in Cuba, where the Pentagon, the CIA, they're hell bent on a regime change operation in Cuba. Why? Well, because Cuba had been taken over by a communist regime, Fidel Castro. They had ousted the pro-U.S. brutal dictator, Fulgencio Batista, who had partnered with the mafia, and they were running casinos. They were making big money. The CIA had free reign in the country. This was a pro-U.S. dictatorship, and Castro had come in and thrown everybody out, the U.S. and the mafia. And so they were furious over this. And so the mafia wanted its casinos back. The U.S. wanted its dictatorship back. They wanted another dictator, either Batista or somebody else that was more friendly to them. And so they were effecting a regime change operation. They also believed that this Castro regime was a grave threat to U.S. national security. That it was, they called it like a communist dagger at America's throat, 90 miles away, and that America just could not survive with this communist regime there. So they come up with a plan of, we've got to get rid of this communist regime. They were obsessed. They're still obsessed with getting rid of the communist regime in Cuba. So part of this obsession was assassination. And this is where the CIA, in a fascinating move, enters into a partnership, an assassination partnership with the mafia. So now you've got the two premier assassination organizations in the world partnering with each other in an overt partnership. You've got the mafia and you've got the CIA, and the connecting, the liaison guy that was kind of doing all the communicating between the two organizations was a guy named Johnny Rosselli. So it starts out, though, with this proposed invasion of Cuba that gotten planned during the Eisenhower years, but the CIA just didn't have time to get it completed. So Kennedy comes into power, and the CIA immediately presents him this plan that, hey, look, we've got to go in there, and this is the way we're going to do it. Cuban exiles are going to conduct the invasion, and the Cuban people are going to rise up because they hate Fidel Castro, and we're going to have freedom in Cuba again under a U.S. dictatorship. Well, Kennedy was reluctant, but he said, look, what about the U.S. role in this? And they said, oh, no, we're going to keep that secret. So Kennedy's job in this thing immediately after becoming president was to become a liar in chief, that he was going to go on national television and said, oh, this invading force of Cuban exiles has liberated Cuba and the U.S. has nothing to do with this. Which would have been kind of interesting, because then the CIA would have had blackmail material on him for the rest of his time in office, because all they would have to do is threaten to reveal the fact that he had lied to the American people about the U.S. role. But Kennedy says, well, are you sure this can succeed without U.S. air support? And they said, oh, absolutely. Well, it was a lie. They set him up. They figured this is a little neophyte president. They knew they would need the air support, and so they figured that once this thing got going, that Kennedy would have to provide the air support to avoid this disaster of the communists defeating these Cuban exiles. There's no way that he would just let them die there. So they were setting him up to take the fall here or go in there and send the air support in. Well, so the invasion starts, and it's a total disaster. Castro was waiting for him, and so sure enough, the CIA says, Mr. President, we need that air support. And the president said, I told you, no air support. You told me you didn't need the air support. Well, yes, sir, but we now need it, which, of course, they knew they were going to need the whole time. It had been a lie. And so what shocked him was Kennedy said, well, you're not going to get it. And so the Cuban exiles went down to defeat. The communists defeated the CIA's army, and A lot of the guys were killed. Some of them were incarcerated. And here was the start of the war between JFK and the national security state. They were furious. They were livid. They considered him a traitor, a coward, a person who had, faced the communists and cut and run, a neophyte and incompetent. But by the same token, Kennedy was furious at them. He knew they had double-crossed him. He knew it had been set up by this organization, the CIA, and so he took public responsibility for it. But he fires Allen Dulles, who was the revered figure, the head of the CIA, which infuriated the CIA even more. He fired his chief deputy. Kennedy is reputed to have said, "I'm going to take the CIA, tear it into 1,000 pieces, and scatter them to the winds." And whether he said it or not, this was his mindset. And they were just as angry at him. And so were the Cuban exiles, who felt that they had been betrayed. So then he puts Bobby Kennedy, his brother, in charge of supervising the CIA, which just infuriated the CIA because they had pretty much had free reign under Eisenhower's regime and do what they wanted. And now here's this 30-something-year-old guy that's monitoring them and controlling them. And the President Kennedy was taking authority away from them. And then the problems start with the military. The military presents Kennedy with a plan to strike the Soviet Union with a nuclear attack, a first-strike nuclear attack, just like the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, a surprise attack. And their argument was, look, this thing's going to end up in a war anyway, hot war. This is a war to the finish, and we could come out on top if we carpet bomb them with a surprise attack with nuclear weapons. We win because they're going to be flattened. Everybody there will be killed. All the communists, which of course they considered every Soviet citizen a communist, that they'd be killed. So Kennedy asked them at this meeting, well, what will they be able to have any retaliatory capacity? And they said, oh yeah, they'll have some. We won't be able to wipe out everything. And Kennedy said, well, how many Americans do you think will be killed here? And they said, oh, not more than 40 million, but we're going to win because all of them will be wiped out. We'll still have, 60 million or so, or whatever the population was. Well, Kennedy was flabbergasted. I mean, he walks away from this meeting and remarks to an aide, and we call ourselves the human race. He said it indignantly. And then they present him with Operation Northwoods, which didn't come out into existence. I mean, people didn't learn about it till the 1990s as part of the Assassination Records Review Board. But at the time they present this plan to Kennedy, it calls for false terrorist attacks committed by CIA or military agents that are posing as communists. So here again, you see, you got government officials posing as communists under this plan. And they're going to do plane hijackings. They're going to kill real Americans in terrorist attacks. They're going to make it look like this is a terrorism by Cuba and by communists. And so they present it to Kennedy, and Kennedy nixes it. He's not going to go down that road because, see, they wanted the justification for invading Cuba, and this Operation Northwoods was going to give them this fake false flag excuse for invading Cuba. Kennedy says no. Well, then there's the Cuban Missile Crisis, where all of a sudden, the CIA discovers that there's Soviet missiles there, and the mainstream press has always said these are offensive weapons, which implies that the Soviet Union and Cuba were going to use them to launch a nuclear attack on the United States. But they were always the exact opposite. They were defensive weapons. That Castro wasn't dumb. He knew through his intelligence sources that the CIA and the Pentagon were pressuring Kennedy to invade Cuba, and he knew that he could beat 1,000 Cuban exiles or so, like at the Bay of Pigs. There was no way he could defeat the U.S. Army in an invasion. It just wasn't going to happen. And so he figured his only chance was to deter such an attack was to install these Soviet missiles there, and that might deter the U.S. from invading. And if nothing else, he wanted them to defend. That if he was going to go down, he was going to take as many people with him as possible. And so that's why the missiles were there, the defensive purposes to deter a U.S. invasion. Well, Kennedy says we can't tolerate this, and he's under tremendous pressure now from the military and the CIA. Now he's got his excuse to invade Cuba, and they were livid because he had rejected Operation Northwoods. You see, Operation Northwoods presumably would have installed a pro-U.S. regime. There would have already been an invasion. They used the false flag excuse, and then the Soviet Union wouldn't be putting missiles in here. So they were livid at what they considered this incompetent, cowardly president that just would not stand up to the communists. And, you know, with this communist dagger 90 miles away. Well, Kennedy strikes a deal with the Soviets. And the mainstream press has always said, well, the Soviets blinked. That's not true. It was Kennedy who blinked. I mean, thank goodness he did, because as it turns out, what the CIA didn't know, and of course what Kennedy didn't know, is that the Soviets already had their nuclear missiles fully armed, and they had given the commanders on the ground battlefield authority to use them in the event of an attack. So they wouldn't have to check back with Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union. They just had the authority to fire the missiles themselves. And one missile would have been a nuclear war, all-out nuclear war. But the CIA didn't realize this, and they were saying invade, and they were putting tremendous pressure on Kennedy, so much so that Bobby Kennedy told the Soviet diplomat with whom he was negotiating, trying to reach a deal on this thing, that my brothers under great pressure were looking at the distinct possibility of a coup. All right, so now we're going back to what Eisenhower's saying, that the national security establishment, the deep state, the military-industrial complex, is a grave threat to the democratic processes. That Kennedy was saying, they may just remove my brother from office and take control of this, because they had no confidence in Kennedy to resolve this. Well, Kennedy strikes a deal where he agrees not to invade Cuba anymore. It's just that he will prohibit the CIA and the Pentagon from ever invading Cuba, which leaves this communist regime permanently in place in Cuba. Well, that was it. I mean, the mindset of the national security establishment was America couldn't survive with this communist dagger 90 miles away. It just couldn't survive. So here's Kennedy. He has struck a deal with the communists, leaving them permanently in place. And for them, this settlement was absolutely incredible. General LeMay on the Joint Chiefs of Staff said that this was the worst defeat in U.S. history. And Kennedy was considered a neophyte, an incompetent, cowardly. He had just sold out America's interests. He had sold out America. I mean, for them, this was getting really close to defeat at the hands of the communist world and the worldwide communist conspiracy that the CIA and the Pentagon and the NSA said was based in Moscow. So that wasn't the end of it. Now, the real war, now that's a big war between the national security state and the president, but the real war gets started on June 10th, 1963. And by this time, because he had come so close to nuclear war, he's got kids, Kennedy achieves a breakthrough. And he realizes that this whole national security state's Cold War is a bunch of bull. It's just a racket. And that this whole thing of scaremongering and the communists are coming to get us is just nonsense. Well, this is anathema to a national security state whose very existence is based on this fear-mongering, that the Russians are coming to get us. I mean, there was even a movie called The Russians Are Coming. The Russians are coming. I mean, the obsession, take the obsession today with Russia, multiply it by 1,000. And here's Kennedy saying, bull, it's a racket. I'm putting an end to it. It's like he just achieved this breakthrough because he realized how close they'd come to nuclear war here. So on June 10th at American University, he gives his famous peace speech where he says, Cold War is over. That's it. We're going to live in peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union. He didn't consult with the Pentagon on the speech or the CIA. He just hit them with it. And it was sort of like a slap in the face because he uses a term called Pax Americana, which General LeMay had used in some speech in a favorable way. There needs to be a Pax Americana around the world. And Kennedy was saying, that's not what we're going to do. And we're going to work with the Soviet Union. We're going to end the Cold War. We're going to live in mutual coexistence. We have different philosophies. Well, this was impossible in the eyes of the national security state. This meant defeat. And so what Kennedy was doing was exactly what Mossadegh had been doing, what Arbenz had been doing, what Castro had been doing, making friends with the Soviet Union, making friends with the communist world. Remember, when they went after those people, it was because it's all or nothing. You're either with us or against us. So now you have a president who is against us for whatever reason, whether they're blackmailing him because of his affairs or just sheer incompetence. They now realize they have a grave national security threat right here domestically. And their mindset is they have to protect national security from all enemies, foreign and domestic. So if a foreign president like Arbenz is a threat to U.S. national security, think what happens when a U.S. president is engaged in conduct that's far worse than what Arbenz was doing. And that, of course, is where we look at the Chilean coup 10 years later, which they tried to keep super secret from the American people. That is the U.S. role in this, even killing 2 Americans, Charles Horman and Frank Tarugi, to keep it silent. Richard Helms committing perjury before Congress. He was the CIA director. Because here you had a national security state, that's what Chile was, just like the post-World War II U.S., that was resistant to a coup. And remember General Schneider, the commanding general, overall commanding general of the Chilean armed forces, says, no, we're not going down this road. And the CIA and the Pentagon are exhorting him. You have to do this. This man's not only a threat to our national security, Salvador Allende, democratically elected president, just like Kennedy, very socialist, just like Kennedy, liberal, progressive, and that Schneider is saying, no, we're not going to go down this road. So they conspire to assassinate him or kidnap him, and which of course involved an assassination and murder. And so they remove Arbenz from the scene, and they convince the national security establishment in Chile that they have a moral duty to remove their democratically elected president because he is a threat to their national security. So even though the Chilean constitution didn't provide for that, their argument is the national security state has the duty, the responsibility to ignore the Constitution because in their minds, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. That if you follow the Constitution and you're going down to the communists, then what's the point? So it's okay for the national security state to violate the Constitution if it saves the country. And that's the mindset. That's the problem they were now faced with Kennedy throwing the gauntlet down saying the Cold War is over, which of course then removes the justification for having a national security state. And back then in '63, Americans still knew what a constitutionally limited government republic was. They had lived under it before the war. Today, of course, Americans don't know what a constitutionally limited government republic is. So when the Cold War ended, like in 1989, everybody just blithely went along with, oh, the CIA stays, the Pentagon stays, because this is all part of a free society. They had no conception that this was a totalitarian structure and that their heritage was a limited government republic. They thought it was the same type of government the whole time. Well, in '63, it was different. So when Kennedy says we're going to end the Cold War, he's essentially saying we're going to end the national security establishment. We're going to dismantle the CIA. We're going to dismantle the NSA. We're going to dismantle the Pentagon, the whole military-industrial complex. He didn't say that, but that's the natural implication. And they had to realize the import of what Kennedy was doing. So not only is he threatening action that is going to cause a communist takeover, he's threatening their existence. And so now the war is on. And so this is where Kennedy then goes and negotiates a nuclear test ban treaty over the fierce objections of the military. They said that this was going to disarm America. They needed this above ground testing, which of course is what they're objecting to when the North Koreans do it. They said that it was essential to our national security to do above ground nuclear testing. And then he starts withdrawing troops from Vietnam, which just was anathema because, this was the communists were trying to take over this whole country, which really was a civil war. But they saw it as part of the domino theory that if the communists win South Vietnam, then they'll go to Thailand, the dominoes would start falling, Europe, Africa, South America, and finally the biggest domino being the U.S. That was their mindset. And so Kennedy is saying to his aides that, well, he ordered the military start withdrawing troops out of Vietnam. And all he had put was advisors. And this was under, again, tremendous pressure. He had resisted the pressure from the military and the CIA to send troops into Laos. He had negotiated a settlement there with the communists. But in Vietnam, he had succumbed to the pressure. But now with this breakthrough, he says, he realizes it's ridiculous. He doesn't want to get the U.S. involved in this land war, so he orders a partial withdrawal of 1,000 troops out of, I don't know, 20,000 or so. And he tells aides, as soon as I win the 64 election, I'm pulling them all out. And then worst of all, from the standpoint of the national security state, Kennedy starts secret negotiations with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who coincidentally has achieved the same breakthrough. I mean, he broadcast Kennedy's peace speech at American University all across the Soviet Union. He thought it was the most remarkable speech of any U.S. president, and maybe since Roosevelt, I think he said. But it was the first time they'd ever done that in the Soviet Union. But they have this remarkable correspondence going on, which was kept secret from the American people after the assassination. But it was just personal, saying, hey, let's do this. And they were circumventing their state departments and Soviet Union's counterpart to their State Department, the Pentagon, their national security state. It was just one-on-one saying, let's do this. And Kennedy even proposed a joint moon project, like going to the moon together, which meant sharing rocket technology. Well, it's a virtual certainty that the CIA was aware of these things, of these negotiations. So here you've got a president of the United States that's secretly talking to the Russian premier about working together. Again, multiply the anti-Russia mindset today by about 1,000, and you see what was going on here. So they're now faced, the national security state is now faced with a real quandary. What do? Well, for them, there's no choice. They've gotten rid of Mossadegh. They've gotten rid of Arbenz. 10 years later, they'd get rid of Allende. They were trying to get rid of Castro. So to protect the country, they're faced with the uncomfortable task that they have to get rid of the president. This was a war to the finish. They had to save America. You see, whenever researchers had brought up this notion that this was a regime change operation, critics say, oh, they would never be that unpatriotic. They don't understand. They were operating out of a sense of patriotism. They were protecting national security by removing a threat to national security. And so that's where, after that peace speech, Oswald is then moved over to New Orleans, where, he's waving the red flag in front of the bull. I'm a communist. I'm a communist. Clearly being positioned. And then he's sent to Mexico City, which of course is still shrouded in mystery. That's part of the secret documents that the CIA still won't reveal. Remember that when the JFK Records Act was enacted after Oliver Stone's movie JFK, they released a lot of the documents, which caused the dam to break on the autopsy, which we'll get to in a minute. But among the records they kept secret was with respect to what was going on in Mexico City, because it was clearly an intelligence operation. After the assassination, they show up with a picture of somebody that's not Oswald, that's supposed to be Oswald. They had a recording where the CIA director calls the president, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, and says, well, we got a recording of Oswald, but the problem is it's not Oswald. Well, that's part of the batch of records that President Trump extended another 3 years of secrecy for. So it's clear that this whole Mexico City thing is still shrouded in mystery. But what's also clear is that Oswald's up there, waving their red flag. Now, Oswald clearly, as an intelligence agency, has to be wondering, why are they doing this? Now, he's a 20-something-year-old guy, 23, 24. He's going to do as he's told. He's like a second lieutenant in the military that, you tell a second lieutenant, do this, he's, yes, sir, right away. He's not going to question orders. But he had to have been wondering, why are they happy doing all this public communism stuff? I've already gone to the Soviet Union. What I'm going to go infiltrate it again? And then they got him in Mexico City. Well, all this time they were monitoring him, which they kept secret, and watching him real carefully. And of course, their argument would be, oh, well, he was a communist, we were monitoring him. Really? Well, then why don't you report it to the FBI or to somebody in Dallas when the president's going to be visiting there and his parade route is right next to, coincidentally, the building where this guy's working? Well, the monitoring had to be for another reason, and that's the frame-up. That if you're framing somebody, you've got to be watching them very carefully to make sure that they're, not onto you, that they're not, suspecting that something's going on. Because if they're onto you, well, that could foil the whole frame-up. So they have to watch him. And so it would stand to reason then that they're not going to warn anybody about this guy in Dallas because they're positioning him. They've got him in this building. They switched the parade route so that it comes right by the building. And so that then reaches the plan, okay? And that concerns the autopsy. Now remember, at the very beginning of the series, I said, we study the autopsy first to understand the assassination. Well, when they're going to frame somebody, clearly the frame has to be good. I mean, it has to. If it's not good, people are going to say, "Oh, well, that's ridiculous." Pieces start falling about. Remember, these people are highly intelligent. They're Ivy Leaguers. They're specializing in the art of assassination and cover-up. Remember, the assassination manual was 10 years before. They have 10 years to be studying the art of assassination and practicing it, like with Lumumba and their partnership with the mafia to assassinate Castro. So these guys have to be very good at what they do. So they come up with a plan to frame this guy. But they know also that this is an assassination of a president. There's going to be a full investigation. I mean, now it was a murder case. They knew that it was going to have to be in Texas. The investigation, the prosecution, it was not a federal offense at this time to assassinate the president. So the federal government had no jurisdiction here. But still, they knew that there was a fierce prosecutor in Texas, in Dallas County, named Henry Wade, and they knew that there would be a full-force investigation. You kill a president, they're going to pull out all stops. You kill a cop, they're going to pull out all stops, or a federal judge, which they did. And there was a federal judge in San Antonio that got assassinated, and man, they pulled out all the stops to bring the malefactors to justice. That's what we would expect. That's how we expect them to operate. So they would know that. So they had to figure out a way to shut down the investigation. And this is where the absolute ingenuity, in a very cunning way, comes into this plan. So they're going to frame a guy in the back, but it's clearly going to be an ambush. I mean, when you're going to assassinate a president, you better be sure you succeed, because if you don't, the president's going to pull out the full force of the government here. So the ambush clearly involves people firing from the back, people firing from the front. All right, so why would you have people firing from the front if you're framing a guy in the back? And that's the sheer ingenuity of this plan, because that's what ensured the shutdown of the investigation. All right, so right after the president's declared dead, there's a press conference with two of the treating physicians at Parkland Hospital, and they said, okay, President Kennedy has an entry wound right here in the throat, an entry wound in the front, which means a shot fired from the front. All right. Then he has a huge hole in the back of his head, in the occipital region, the lower back of the head, like an orange-sized hole, which means an exit wound. Now, remember, a bullet comes in with a small little hole, it pushes brain mass in front of it, it blows out the back. And then we've got all the witnesses, you recall, that establish that you've got the occipital bone, the Harper fragment they found. You've got all the treating physicians at the time said that he had this huge exit wound, which is why they couldn't save his life. They knew as soon as they saw this. One of the doctors even said this wound is not consistent with life, or something like that, which meant there was nothing they could do. Nobody could survive a wound like that. And then you've got the bystanders who were splattered in the back of the limousine, indicating that this hole in the back of the head was just blowing out. You've got the two nurses, the treating physician, the treating nurse, and then the nurse that was helping him out of the car, that said, yeah, that huge hole. And then you've got the Secret Service agent, Clint Hill, who was, covering the president all the way to Parkland. He verified that massive exit wound was there. You got the FBI agents who looked at the official photographs and said, no, they look doctored. This man had a massive wound in the back of his head. And then you got all the inconsistent stories from the three pathologists about the massive exit wound. So clearly there's these shots fired from the front, and they knew this, but they used this as a way to shut down the investigation. Now, how did they do that? Well, if you have a shooter from the rear who's a communist, and that was the idea, you got Lee Harvey Oswald, communist, nobody knows he's an intelligence agent, or nobody outside the CIA knows it, For all practical purposes, the stories worked great. You know, they've got him in New Orleans. I'm a communist. They've got him defecting to the Soviet Union. They got him to Mexico City. So clearly he's a communist. And then don't forget, you've got the DRE, which is that Cuban exile group in New Orleans, which is being secretly funded by the CIA, monitored by CIA agent George Joanides. They're the first ones to immediately come out with a press release giving all of Oswald's communist bona fides. You know, telling people he's a communist, he's a communist. So they're really building the story up. So if they've got a communist in the rear, the only people who could have fired these shots from the front had to be his communist cohorts. There's nobody else. I mean, like what? His co-workers at the school book depository? Ridiculous. His friends, you know what friends? It had to be a communist conspiracy. That's why they had the shots fired from the front, to establish that this was a communist conspiracy as a way to shut down the investigation. Because why is that? Well, because if the communists have killed the president, that means world war, nuclear war. I mean, remember this, the Cuban Missile Crisis had just been a year before. And if there was anything that scared the American people, it was the prospect of nuclear war. So here you now have the almost certain fact that this is nuclear war. All right, well, you might say, well, why not? If the communists have killed the president, if we have to go to war, we have to go to war, because clearly there's going to have to be retaliation. How do you retaliate for this? You drop a bomb on Moscow, a nuclear bomb, to make sure you get the president? Well, that's all-out nuclear war. Well, here's where the CIA and the mafia's assassination scheme comes into play. How does Johnson justify going to nuclear war when it's the CIA who has established the assassination game in the first place? You see, so that's the perfect justification for saying, we can't go to war over this. We started it. They're just retaliating. We got to just get Oswald. He's the guy who did the shooting anyway, and just let it go. Just let it go and move on. Okay? So that was how they get the investigation shut down, the nuclear war prospect. In fact, when Henry Wade, the prosecutor I mentioned in Dallas County, on the very night of the assassination, he's charging Oswald with a worldwide communist conspiracy to assassinate the president. Lyndon Johnson calls him up and says, you got to shut that allegation down. You got to eliminate it. What do you want, nuclear war here? So you see, Johnson's role in this was to say, there could be a nuclear war here. And of course, again, that scares the American people to no end. It scares everybody. And so and Wade says, oh, okay, wait. And Wade immediately folds. And the FBI goes and takes control of all his investigation records and so forth. So then when Johnson's appointing the Warren Commission, Chief Justice of the United States Earl Warren says, I'm not going to serve. Johnson brings up the nuclear war scenario and says, if you don't serve, we're looking at the prospect of nuclear war. So you see, he's using the shots fired from the front as a way to shut down, to get Warren to come in, to shut down the investigation, pin it on Oswald, and move on. And then he does the same thing with Richard Russell, a U.S. Senator, who said, I hate Warren, I'm not going to serve on the Warren Commission. And Johnson brings up the 40 million figure again that would die in a nuclear war. Well, why would he bring that up if this was just a lone nut assassin? He brought it up in order to get these people on board that would just pin it on Oswald, who nobody ever doubted had done the shooting. Nobody ever doubted that. Now, Oswald is there claiming he's innocent, but nobody ever gave that anything but short shrift. I mean, he's clearly lying. We're not even going to go down that road. And he was saying, not only did I not do this, I'm a patsy. I'm being framed here. But nobody ever gave that any serious consideration. So as part of the plan, you see, the plan is to get rid of Kennedy and elevate Johnson. So you don't need to have a military takeover, because Johnson's mindset is exactly on the same page as the military said. You know, the communists are coming to get us, communist threat. And Johnson had made that clear throughout the disputes between Kennedy and the national security state. Johnson had always sided with the national security state. So he was one of them. So they could safely eliminate Kennedy and know that one of their people was going to be elevated into office. And sure enough, Johnson immediately reverses the policies. He, sends troops into Vietnam, and of course that's where they ultimately reach 500,000 and 58,000 or so American casualties, deaths, and that was all Lyndon Johnson in the national security state. So to pull this off, they have to have a fraudulent autopsy. They have to show that, hey, there's no shots fired from the front. You see, because they're operating on two tracks here now. To shut down the investigation, they're conjuring up this image of a communist conspiracy based on the fact that shots actually were fired from the front. But to calm and pacify the American people, they're operating on another track, and they're saying, no, 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 this is a lone nut. This is a lone nut. We're shutting it down because it's just a lone nut. And go about your lives, move on. And so that's what the fraudulent autopsy was about. Now, it's triggered at 1 p.m. on the day of the assassination when Kennedy's declared dead. That's when the Secret Service team goes into action, brandishing their guns and yelling and screaming and saying, we're going to get this body out of here and take it to Washington. We're operating under orders. And Dr. Earl Rose, the medical examiner, said, you're not going anywhere. I am required by Texas law to conduct this autopsy. Well, if Rose had conducted the autopsy, he would have clearly established that these shots were fired from the front. And that's not what they wanted, because you see, they wanted to use that only as a way to shut down investigations. They didn't want Americans to learn that, because if Americans learned that the shots were fired from the front, they would demand action against the communists, like nuclear reaction or something like that, which would then expose the CIA. Johnson would have to say, well, we can't really go down that road to retaliate because the CIA started this assassination scheme. So on this second level, they're keeping secret from the American people the fact that the shots are fired from the front. So that's why that team of Secret Service agents who's operating on orders says, we're taking this body with us. Meanwhile, Johnson, who had to be the one issuing the order, is heading to Parkland Hospital, to Love Field, where he's having seats removed from the back of Air Force One, which clearly indicates circumstantial evidence that he's the one who issued the order. How else would he know that the casket was coming? And so they get the casket over there. Johnson's lollygagging. Again, he presents this notion of, oh, this could be a first stage of a nuclear attack. So you see, he's conjuring that thing up. That was clearly part of his role here. And but he's lollygagging and trying to get sworn in, even though Bobby Kennedy told him he didn't need to. And so the whole thing is very revealing, because Johnson clearly has no concern about a nuclear attack at all, even though he's saying that. And the only reason he could have no concern at all is if he knows that as 100% certainty that the Soviets were not involved in this. And clearly that he had that 100% certainty because he knew that it was a national security state operation that he was part of, because he's the guy that launches the fraudulent autopsy scheme by issuing this order for the Secret Service agents to get this thing out. Now, ask yourself, how could they have come up with a false and fraudulent autopsy scheme in the 1/2 hour between the time Kennedy was shot and the time that the thing was launched at 1 p.m., where the Secret Service team goes into action? There's no way. There's no way in that 1/2 hour that Johnson's going to sit there and say, I think we need a fake autopsy here. Could be a communist threat, because you see, they don't even have Lee Harvey Oswald in custody yet. He's not taken into custody until around 1 o'clock, around the time the president was killed. So this plan clearly has to be coming into existence. For it to be launched at 1, it has to be contemplated before 1, before they have a communist in custody. So they can't be sitting there saying, oh, we need to protect against the thought of a communist threat, and we're going to have a fraudulent autopsy. I'm going to have to get on the phone and call Bethesda Hospital, a military hospital, and naval hospital, and tell them that we need a fraudulent autopsy. It's clear, just through logic and circumstantial evidence, that this is a scheme that had to have come into existence prior to the assassination, which can only mean one thing, and that is that the cover-up, the fraudulent autopsy, was built in as part of the assassination itself. There is no other reasonable conclusion. It either comes into existence in that 1/2 hour, which is ridiculous, or it comes into existence before, which is reasonable. But if it comes into existence before, it has to be part of the assassination itself. So by understanding that principle alone, about when the fraudulent autopsy scheme had to have come into existence, we can see who it was who initiated the assassination. And so then that's when they arrive in Maryland. Johnson arrives there with the casket, and instead of turning it over to a local coroner, remember, this is not a military nation. There's no war here. The Pentagon did not have jurisdiction over this autopsy or this assassination, but they take control over the autopsy. And why? Because there's a super secret climate in the military. And sure enough, all the participants were sworn to secrecy. One of them said they put the fear of God in us if we ever talked. They were given letters of secrecy. I'm not sure whether they were forced to sign them or not, but they were all told, this is national security, this is top secret, you will never talk. And it held. I mean, that's how the military works. And so they sneaked the body in, and enlisted men there later said that, yeah, the body was brought in through the back, through a shipping casket. So clearly they had removed the body out of the Dallas casket, put it in there, took the body in. The pathologists there, who clearly were just told that this is national security, you need to do this, you need to hide the fact that there were shots fired from the front, we're looking at the prospect of nuclear war, and you will take this to the grave with you. You will never talk. And then they clearly had to have taken vows of secrecy from the pathologists. And so they hide the fact that there's these shots fired from the front. That's where you end up with these fake photographs, which show the back of President Kennedy's head to be fully intact. That is no great big exit wound. They're just defrauding people as to the nature of the wounds. And remember Saundra Spencer's devastating testimony. I mean, she's the U.S. Navy petty officer. She works in the Navy's top secret photography lab. She works with the White House. Nobody has ever questioned her veracity, her credibility, her competence. She says, they asked me to develop the autopsy photographs. That was her job, developing photographs on a top secret basis. And she said, it was pretty clear that this is all top secret. But 30 years later, before the Assassination Records Review Board, she says, she looks at the official photographs and says, no, those are not the photographs I developed. The photographs I developed showed this massive exit wound. So there's clearly fraud going on here. And then, of course, the other devastating revelation is when Commander Humes is calling Colonel Fink at 8 p.m., which was the official entry of the Dallas casket and the president's body into the morgue. And he calls Fink and he says, can you come and help us? We already have x-rays of the head that we've taken. Well, how could they already have x-rays of the head if the body's officially being brought in at 8, the same time as the phone call? Major slip up, what the law calls an admission against interest. There's no way to avoid that. And sure enough, there was the x-ray corpsman who was helping with the x-ray, the technician, and he said that he was taking these x-rays through the main foyer at around 8 when he saw Mrs. Kennedy come in the front door, because her car with the casket, the Dallas casket, empty Dallas casket, had arrived at 8 o'clock. So he verifies that if the casket's out there in the front, it's got to be empty because he's got these x-rays. And that, of course, corroborates the admission against interest, where Humes is saying we already have x-rays of the president's head at 8 when the body's being officially brought in at 8 p.m., which obviously indicates virtually conclusively that they already had the body that had been sneaked in early. So you've got this massive fraudulent autopsy that succeeds, and the secrecy succeeds. The dam starts to break during the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 70s, when these enlisted men were released from their vows of secrecy and started talking about how they carried the body in early at 6:35 p.m. And then you got all the way to the 90s, people are still really suspicious of the whole official story. And that's when Oliver Stone comes out with his movie JFK that posits that this was a national security state regime change operation. They're still keeping all their records secret based on national security. That motivates the JFK Records Act, the Assassination Records Review Board, and then the dam just breaks on the autopsy. And that's all encapsulated in Douglas Horne's fantastic watershed book, Inside the Assassination Records Review Board. Horne was a member of the ARRB, and so his book it's mammoth. I mean, it's 5 volumes. It's huge, but you'll read this thing, and a lot of it you won't understand. Some of it's very complex in dealing with photography and X-rays, but you'll understand 70 or 80% of it. And at the end of that book, you'll inevitably reach the conclusion this was no doubt a fraudulent autopsy. And of course, there is no innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy. There's none. You can't come up with one. That the only explanation is nefarious, and that is cover-up. And that's a cover-up of an assassination that was committed by the national security state. Because remember, as we discussed in the very first segment, there's one undisputed fact here, and that's what we started this series with. That undisputed fact is that the U.S. military conducted the autopsy. So whenever you hear all these conspiracy theories, the mafia did it, the space aliens did it, the Cubans did it, the Soviets did it, the Mossad did it, keep in mind one thing, and none of those institutions had anything to do with the autopsy. There was one and only one entity that ran that fraudulent autopsy. That was the U.S. military. So there's no innocent explanation for this. No one can come up with an innocent explanation. A fraudulent autopsy necessarily involves nefarious things. And those nefarious things are that the national cover-up of the national security state's assassination regime change operation. Now, remember how we drew that dichotomy, how the press always says, did Oswald act alone or did he act in a conspiracy? And that's the way they always present it. You see, they never, ever look at the third alternative. Was this an innocent man? Was he really being framed? And their motive always is, oh, well, he was a big man he's a little man trying to become a big man by killing a big man. Except that Oswald denied it. If that's really his motive, don't you think he'd say, I killed the president, I'm a big man now. Unless you believe in this convoluted thought process where he says, well, I'm going to get acquitted first, and then I'm going to go out and admit that I did it, and then I'm going to be a big man. It's ridiculous. So, you've got on the one side, okay, the lone nut theory, that he killed the president. Okay, then why would the military conduct a fraudulent autopsy to protect a lone nut like him? Or if you put him in a conspiracy, like with the communists, why would the military conduct a fraudulent autopsy to protect the communists? They hated the communists. So when you look at those two alternatives that the mainstream press presents, they're ridiculous. And keep in mind that Oswald's not arrested till 1 p.m. anyway. They launched the autopsy at about that time, 1 p.m. So they can't be doing it to protect Oswald or his supposed conspiracy because they don't have the conspirator in their hands yet. Now, if he had been killed at the school book depository at 12:30, then things would be different. Then when they launched the thing at 1, they could say, oh, well, we did a quick background check. He was a communist. We figured we might be looking at World War III here. But you see, by virtue of the fact that Oswald gets away without being killed at the school book depository, and his arrest isn't done till 1, as quickly as it was, it was one of the most remarkable arrests ever. And that they be able to pick him up within, that short a period of time. But it foils their plan with respect to the fraudulent autopsy because, again, there's no innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy. It has to be built in as part of the scheme. So the Assassination Records Review Board comes into existence, and you have this dam breaking loose on the autopsy. So I recommended Horn's book. I recommend also my book, The Kennedy Autopsy, which is essentially a very short, readable synopsis of Horn's book. So if Horn's book looks daunting, take a look at The Kennedy Autopsy. Also, take a look at Horn's FFF book, JFK's War with the National Security Establishment, Why Kennedy Was Assassinated. Fantastic little, short, easy-to-read book that talks about motive. That what was the motive here? And it goes over a lot of what I've discussed here about this war that was taking place. And Horn's a real scholar and a historian, and he'll set it forth. He sets it forth very well in this book. I also recommend a book called JFK and the Unspeakable by James Douglas. It is the absolutely best introduction to what happened here that you'll ever read. And I couldn't recommend it more highly. And then we've got another book, CIA and JFK, The Secret Assassination Files by Jefferson Morley. Morley's the guy that discovered the existence of George Joanides. He's a former Washington Post investigative reporter, and the DRE connection to all this. Fascinating story there. And then I guess that's, oh yeah, Horn's got a fantastic video series also for FFF. You can go on our website at fff.org, the Future of Freedom Foundation, and look in our video section, our multimedia section, and you'll see a long series of maybe 6 or 7 parts by Doug Horn, predominantly around the autopsy, but even more than that, putting everything in the context of really what we've talked about in this series. So that pretty much wraps up where we are now. Oh yeah, one more book, the Evil of the National Security State that I've written. Well, it's technically called the CIA, Terrorism, and the Cold War: The Evil of the National Security State, which brings us to the final lesson of this whole series. People have asked me over the years, why do you spend so much time on the JFK assassination? And, well, the reason is, well, truth matters. I mean, the nation's got to come to truth with this regime change operation. Ever since the Kennedy assassination, I mean, this country's been a total mess. I mean, when you disrupt a country through an assassination like that, it has ramifications that are immeasurable. I mean, look at Iran, the regime change operation there. We're still living with that. 53, and that's the root of the Iran relations, or Guatemala. I mean, they were thrown into a 30-year civil war because of the regime change operation. And you see the same chaos here in the distrust in government and so forth. And that's because of that assassination and the existence of the national security state. And so obviously people are already dead that committed this assassination, and we're not talking about bringing people to justice. So part of it's the truth. I mean, grappling with the truth. This is just part of our history, this regime change operation here. And coming to grips with that and what the meaning of it is, the significance of it, and comparing it to other regime change operations that were being carried out against presidents like Lumumba and Arbenz, and prime ministers like Mossadegh, and presidents like Allende, and many others. But the real lesson here is this totalitarian structure. That's why it's still relevant. We're still living under a national security state, the same totalitarian structure that came into existence, that replaced our constitutionally limited government republic, and that, as Eisenhower pointed out, is an even more grave threat to our democratic process and our freedom than ever. It's still in existence. It's the most powerful part of the federal government. It is essentially a fourth branch. Another book I recommend is Double Government by Michael Glennon, who's a professor of law at Tufts University. He shows how this national security branch is really the most powerful branch. It trumps all the other 3 branches. It permits them to have a veneer of authority, but everybody knows that the real power in Washington is with this national security branch, which is even based outside of Washington. The other 3 branches are in Washington. The national security state branches in Virginia and Maryland, the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA. And it's no different, for example, in Pakistan or Egypt, where the military is in charge, but over there it's overt, the military intelligence. It's overt. I mean, everybody realizes, they see that they're in charge. Here, it's kept off the radar screen. But everybody in Washington knows where the power is. So if Trump says, I'm going to pull the troops out of Syria immediately, the national security state says no, well, the no is going to win. That's just the way it is. And it's that structure that needs to be abandoned. It needs to be rejected. That this is not our heritage. Our heritage is a limited government republic, and that thing should never have been brought into existence. You don't fight totalitarian communist tyranny by adopting their communist totalitarian governmental structure. You fight communist tyranny with freedom and limited government. And that was the biggest mistake in American history, was converting the federal government to a national security state. And we, the American people, have the right. We have the right to have our limited government republic back. The Cold War, which was the original justification for this junk, it went out of existence in 1989. That's when we should have gotten our republic back. That's what they had said in the beginning when the conversion took place. As soon as the Cold War is over, you can have your republic back. Well, we didn't get our republic back, and we're entitled to have our republic back. It's our right to have. This is our heritage. And so in order to achieve a free society, that is a necessary prerequisite. It's not a sufficient prerequisite. There's a lot of other factors that welfare state, the drug war, and so forth. But a necessary prerequisite for a free society is the dismantling of the national security state and the restoration of a constitutionally limited government. Thank you very much.